Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. A lot of news to cover. Negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, progress or not? Putin is suggesting, or at least his military, that they're having finished the first part of their operation and are now thinking about finishing off the war, whatever that means. And then we're going to look at the Middle East, a major summit between Arab and Israeli and U.S. leaders, as well as some progress or not on the Iran nuclear deal. Joining us this week from Brussels, Steve Erlanger, chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times. Steve, great to see you.
Nice to see you.
And from Washington, D.C., Karen DeYoung, associate editor and senior national security correspondent for the Washington Post. Hi, Karen. And also from Washington, D.C., Ed Luce, who is the chief U.S. commentator and editor of the Financial Times. Ed, great to have you back. Hope the research on your book has been going well.
Thank you,
Steve. Let's start with you. Negotiations in person were taking place in Istanbul. All kinds of words, mostly from the Ukrainians, that things and the Turks that there was progress being made. The Russians shut the door on that pretty quickly the next day and said there had been no progress. They're back at talking to each other. There seems to be a humanitarian corridor now opening up to Mariupol, a place that has been bombarded for the last 6 weeks. The war is also continuing. How would you, as we enter our 6th week, how would you characterize where we are today and particularly on the political side, whether there's any end in sight of this fighting?
I try to be optimistic. I really do, but I'm not. I mean, I think the war is in its second phase, which in a way should have been its first phase if the Russian military had been doing this intelligently. I don't think Putin's ready to give up. I don't think the negotiations are real at the moment. I think they're just a continuation of the war by other means, true on both sides, frankly. The hardest discussions have not yet been had, which are about territorial concessions or what happens, never mind Crimea, but what happens to the Donbass, to these two so-called independent republics that Putin has actually declared. Now those, their final status might in the end be up for negotiation, but it still feels like the Russian army, as Zelensky told The Economist the other day, it just keeps sending in more and more stuff. They just keep coming and coming and coming. And the Russian army is pretty brutal. So it's amazing, they haven't taken Mariupol yet, but they're basically destroying it. And I do think what the Russians are doing is being much more realistic about their war aims, first of all, at least for now. And they are kind of playing the negotiations along because one must always sound like one's willing to negotiate. But Putin has not done well enough. His army is not done well enough to enter serious negotiations. And I don't think the Ukrainians feel ready to make concessions either. There's a lot of talk, about neutrality, because after all, Ukraine was neutral under Yanukovych. It wasn't until after Russia annexed Crimea and Yanukovych was thrown out that Ukraine put its desire to join NATO into its constitution, and they could take it out again too. But then the question becomes, who guarantees their security? And the Ukrainians say, oh, well, let's get NATO to guarantee our security. All these NATO countries. Well, the NATO countries, these are the same NATO countries that won't fight for Ukraine now. So why will they fight for Ukraine later? I mean, it just seems a little bit fake right now. I'm sorry to say that. Eventually things end. I don't think this will end in a simple way. It won't be like a simple treaty. Most Russian aggressions end messily and they never quite end. I mean, if you look at what's going on in South Ossetia or Georgia or even Crimea or the Donbass. Nothing ever quite finishes. And so I just don't think we're there. I mean, I'd like us to be there, but not yet. Pakam yet, I'm afraid.
Ed, how do you see it? You share the judgment, Steve, that sort of, as Richard Haas would say, the conflict just isn't ripe yet for a negotiated settlement, that more needs to be playing out on the ground before either party is really willing to think seriously about what are they willing to settle for, which presumably is almost by definition less than that they're fighting for. How do you see it? And is there anything the West or the United States could be doing to accelerate the possibility of some kind of end to this fighting and some kind of not only a ceasefire, but frankly a real end to the conflict?
Well, I mean, I suspect I'm picking up on what Steve said, which I'd like to disagree with, but don't. I suspect that ironically, the quickest way of bringing this to a negotiated settlement is to step up the supply of arms to Ukraine. And I think that's probably the feeling, certainly that I'm picking up from the Biden administration and other Western governments, Britain, and of course the border NATO countries in particular, which are probably the most resolute. And that's going to involve, discussions about, whether eventually there will be planes for Ukraine, there will be an air defense system for Ukraine so that it can really start to hit Russia back in the skies, as well as the usual sort of anti-tank and low-flying aircraft missiles, handheld missile rockets that we've been flooding Ukraine with. That is something that Zelensky keeps asking for. The prospect of Russia agreeing to what it has or something around what it has in a negotiated settlement at this point is, I think, really, really far-fetched. Putin, however much of a grip he has on the Russian media and the propaganda funnel into Russian homes, cannot sell what's happened in the last 5 weeks as anything close to a Russian victory. So Russia's nowhere near the point, I don't believe, of wanting a negotiated exit to this war. It's going to want much, much more territory, much, much more, and particularly Mariupol, which, every day we hear Mariupol's about to fall. It's still holding on. But particularly Mariupol, if he wants Donbass and the Crimea to be linked by that land bridge. And the propaganda benefit of capturing the place where the Azov battalion, which is the one sort of splinter neo-Nazi element in Ukraine that would enable Putin to say, look, we are denazifying Ukraine. From Zelensky's point of view, there's been 10 million displaced Ukrainians, almost 4 million of whom are now scattered across Europe, mostly in Poland, but outside of their homes, mostly not male fighting age Ukrainians. So families are split across the country. There is going to be pressure eventually on Zelensky, to end this war too, but not now. Ukrainians think they're winning. So if the basis of negotiation, of a successful prospect for negotiation, is both sides are exhausted, we're nowhere near that point.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunately that sounds right to me. Karen, one, do you agree? And then secondly, what are you picking up on your reporting in Washington from the administration, which seems to be pretty pessimistic about a negotiation as well, particularly a Russian willingness to really negotiate? And then one other issue that I'd love you to address is what Steve raised on the security guarantees. There is this idea that sort of neutrality is going to be the answer, but it needs to be guaranteed. And that guarantee is supposed to be pretty much like a NATO guarantee for all practical purpose. In fact, I've heard Ukrainians say it's got to be better than a NATO guarantee. So what's the discussion in Washington on that, which in the end, I think we can't avoid, no matter how this ends.
I think I agree that this is going to go on for some time. I don't think it's anywhere close to ending. And what has consistently surprised me in Washington is, despite all the intercepts and the open radio channels that the Russian forces are using, and the military people here saying, gosh, how come they don't have a combined operation strategy, and how come their aircraft don't talk to the people on the ground and the Navy doesn't talk to the Air Force, and that's why they're doing so badly. Despite all of that, I think that there's a lack of knowledge here about what's going on in the negotiations. They're not sure they believe what the Ukrainians are telling them, and different Ukrainians are telling them different things about what's going on and what they're prepared to do. At the same time, I think that there are some differences within NATO about what's an acceptable negotiated settlement. When there's talk about some kind of either autonomy or Russian control of the Donbass, a return of Crimea, whether it's now or in 15 years, as some have said. There are people in NATO, kind of led by the Brits, who are the most outspoken about this, that say, no, that's not acceptable. Putin has to be seen to lose everything. And if he doesn't, then we're not lifting any sanctions, and we're going to keep on in the direction we're going. There's some bad feelings about what happened after 2014, where yes, sanctions sort of stayed, but the NATO-Russian Council sort of started up again, and it all seemed to at least partially fade away. And they say, no, this is so horrific, he's got to lose. On the other hand, the public statement is of the United States, Germany, and others is this is a sovereign decision of Ukraine. They get to decide what they're going to settle for. So I think that's an argument still to be had. In terms of guarantees, again, it's not at all clear what they're talking about. I was listening to Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff last week, who spoke on a video here, who said, yes, we've gotten commitments from Canada, from a lot of Europeans, and we're going to have guarantees. And not only does that make people in the West uncomfortable, but it's not clear what he's talking about. Some people say it's, yes, we're going to continue to supply them weapons, going to continue to train, going to continue to support their economy and bash the Russian economy. Others say, no, that means, we will defend them. We'll go in and defend them. I don't think that's at all what anybody in NATO has in mind, but it's been left sort of vague because nobody really knows what's going on, if anything, of substance in the negotiations.
I mean, Steve, we've been through this before. Remember, in 1994, the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons in return for assurances. They weren't guarantees, which is why they want guarantees now, that turned out to be not even worth the paper that the assurances were written on, which was an assurance by Russia, the UK, and the United States, that they would respect the territorial integrity and the borders as they then existed. And that was the assurance they got. Well, that turned out not to be much. So I can understand why the Ukrainians want real security guarantees. What I don't understand is why the Russians would even want to have a discussion about this, or where the discussion is in the United States and in Europe about the degree to which people are willing to do that. I mean, I think we should do that, but that's, who am I?
Well, I think, you're right. And Karen puts her finger on a real ambiguity, right? Because if Zelensky is in charge of what happens, well, it could be Armageddon, or it could be concessions. And if we frame this as a war, as we always frame our wars, evil and good, then it's very hard to actually have a compromise, let alone a messy conclusion, which is much, much more likely. And if, as I've heard Boris Johnson, Putin has to lose, well, then do something about it, right? But nobody's willing to do anything. I mean, they're not going to fight in Ukraine. And unless they're going to fight in Ukraine, the imbalance is finally going to make a difference. As brave as the Ukrainians are, I have every sympathy for them. I admire them. I think Zelensky has shocked the world. He's shocked himself, I think, by playing the president that he was acting as before, kind of the way Ronald Reagan played the president. Good actors can do this. But I just think, in the end, there's going to have to be, at least in Putin's mind, there's a Russia which existed under the empire before the Soviet Union gave chunks to Ukraine. And there's this Polish Ukraine in the West. And I think in his dreams, there's a real partition. And right now, we can say it's important that he lose. And we can say, Zelensky, he shouldn't give up. But are we going to let all the Ukrainians die because we think it's a bad solution? I mean, we really haven't thought this through very well. I think Karen's got her finger on a very important point. And of course, in the end, it'll be partly Washington's decision, because that will influence what every NATO country decides to do. The other thing I should just say is we're pouring tons of stuff into Ukraine. You have no idea. I mean, a lot of it's secret, but the French haven't said a word, but they're pouring stuff in. The Germans are pouring stuff in, much more than they say, and we're pouring stuff in, and we're giving them lots of intel and lots of communications. And if I am just guessing, but I think quite a lot of these Ukrainian generals who have died because American intel has pinpointed their position.
Russian generals.
Russian generals.
Yeah, Russian generals. Sorry. Precisely. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Ed, I think we talked a lot about what the West and the Ukrainians. I think the Putin question, I think, is also an important one. And we've all, I think, become students of Vladimir Putin in the last few months in one form or another. There's been some really terrific reporting and writing. Of course, there's been long reporting and writing. What does your gut tell you? Where is Putin? Is this idea that somehow they're changing the war aims to something less than ultimately they set out to do? How do you read it? Where do you, and importantly, what do you make of this report coming out of the US and the UK intelligence that he's being misinformed, he's being misled? Is sort of information warfare that is going on that we're doing, or just how do you see the man in the Kremlin and what he's trying to do?
With the sole exception of our intelligence agencies' overestimation of Russia's military capabilities, and they're by no means alone. Putin also clearly overestimated, along with every think tank in the West, it seems, Russia's military capabilities. With that exception, the CIA, the DIA, GCHQ, the MIs, and the West intelligence, particularly the English-speaking intelligence, has acquitted itself extremely well. They've called this right, and I suspect, as Steve says, they're providing, because of communications, the fact that Ukraine's communications are still functioning. They're providing not just real-time intelligence to, headquarters, but to people on the ground. There is a tank formation a mile from you, etc. We're getting that kind of support. The selected leak of Western intelligence, this was clearly a coordinated one this week about Putin being misinformed of how badly it's going, was, I think, a giant troll. I mean, this is really messing with Putin's head here. Not only that, he's got probably very valid suspicions that there are leaks from within the Kremlin, the supposedly tiny circles, very tightly held Kremlin is leaky, but designed also to increase his suspicion of them, which of course might produce bad consequences. Because you ask what is it that Putin ultimately wants? Well, we know what he ultimately doesn't want, and that's humiliation. And right now it's humiliation. We know that from over a period of years, he's been more and more focusing on history, on the larger Tsarist pre-Soviet map, that he's sort of parading in a mirror with, Ivan the Terrible and Catherine the Great. That's how he sees himself, as a man of territory and Russian greatness, and almost sort of messianic. There's just no way he can sell the current situation as anything like a victory. It's a humiliation. So I would be extremely skeptical, even if there were a short-term deal. I would be extremely skeptical that it was anything other than a tactical pause in his head, whilst he tries to reorganize the Russian military command, regroup, resupply, and rethink how to plan the next phase in the war. And I suspect that that's the reading of Western governments and intelligence agencies. But I can't stress enough how unusual this use of Western intelligence is. It's almost Russian in terms of its psychological impact. This is gray zone. This is the West operating in the gray zone very effectively.
Yeah, I was struck that the Kremlin's response to the release of this information was that, quote, the West doesn't understand how decision making operates. Well, actually, this is not about decision making. They didn't quite deny the fact that he was being misinformed. This is about the little tiny group really leaking in the way that you said, Ed. And I think it's playing with his head is exactly what they were trying to do. What the outcome of that is, I think, is important. And Karen, sort of what is the reading in Washington that you get of Putin's aim? Do you think to what extent are people worried in Washington that they need to find a way out for him, that avoiding humiliation, as I think Ed is, I think everybody agrees that humiliation pushes him into a corner. I think it was Ben Wallace, the UK defense minister, who just said that he's in a cage of his own making. In a cage still there. And just a week ago, we were talking about escalation, chemical weapons, perhaps even nuclear weapons was the topic of du jour. It isn't this week, but how does Washington, in your sense, think about where Putin is and what he might do?
Well, you remember that during the lead up to the invasion, we had lots of talk about providing off ramps for Putin. He could do this, he could do that. Let's discuss this, and then he never took any of them to the extent they were recognized by him as genuine off ramps. I don't think that they're thinking in terms of off ramps too much now. I think that they, I think that there's a danger for them to be in the West to be too enthralled by the sort of narrative of the plucky Ukrainians. I mean, they're doing a fantastic job. Obviously, it's been a surprise to the Russians, but I think what Steve said earlier is true. They haven't used even half of their firepower yet, and they have a lot of other things that they could do. And to some extent, you're seeing them start to do that now. That this supposed withdrawal from around Kyiv and some other places in the north and the northeast is not seen as a withdrawal at all. It's sending more troops around. They're trying very hard, apparently, the Russians to surround a massive Ukrainian force of about 40,000 men who are around on the western side of the Donbass. And if they can surround those people, they will severely diminish the Ukrainian forces available to fight other places. And at the same time, they're bombarding Kyiv. They may be pulling troops back, but they're bombarding them. And the bombardment largely comes from outside of Ukrainian territory, which makes it very difficult for anyone to decide what to do about anti-air defense and other things that would mean attacking Russian planes in Russian or Belarusian airspace. So I think that, I find it very difficult to believe that Putin's problem is that he's been misinformed about how things are going on the ground. I mean, the Russian people may have been cut off from social media and satellite TV and stuff. Putin's not. I think that he maybe I'm overestimating his ability to deal with reality. I don't know, but he can see, I think, what's happening. I do think, though, that these reports of the generals being killed, of looking at what appear to be massive strategic blunders in terms of how they've fought this war, has got to give him second thoughts. Whether he blames the people in charge of the military, there are tons of rumors that the defense minister Shoigu is on the outs and not long for this world, and everybody keeps waiting for him to disappear, as he did for several weeks last month, before they kind of plastered his picture up to say, oh no, he's still here. But there's obviously concern. I don't think it's because Putin doesn't know what's going on. I think it's because he does know what's going on.
Interesting. Your paper, by the way, had a terrific story about the Pentagon sort of being giddy, but the fact that the Ukrainians were so effective and sort of patting themselves on the back that it was all U.S. Army training and everything else, which, given our record in training forces in Afghanistan and Iraq takes chutzpah. It might actually have to do with the fact that the country was invaded and people decided to defend themselves. Morale has something to do with that, but it shows the danger of overestimating. And just because it's been good for 5 weeks, and Steve, you made this point, it doesn't mean it's going to continue to be good forever. There's only so many weapons you can flow into the country, and so many people who can use them effectively until it gets to the end. Is that how Putin is looking at it, you think?
Well, I mean, one of these terrible things one has to say, but it's very hard to remember a Russian war that began well. They usually begin very badly, and they bumble around. They did this in Grozny. They're just terrible at going, and then finally they adapt and figure it out. Now, of course, what's interesting is, they're fighting basically a Western trained army, which I haven't done in quite a long time, with really good, fancy equipment, which, the Ukrainians didn't have before. And of course, they're at home. And then if you argue like Putin that they're just one people, then it's very hard to get into your head. You're shooting your brothers and your sisters and your uncles. I mean, these are not, ragheads, right? These are not evil people. These are yourselves. And it's a very hard thing to do, particularly since most of these young Russian soldiers didn't even know that they were going in. I think that much is true. So, I just don't see the threat to Putin. I mean, this is the problem. I mean, there may be a threat. I mean, Khrushchev was quietly removed, but, there's a Politburo to do it. I mean, and who dares? It's going to be very interesting to see really what happens. I mean, there's no question, I think, from people who've seen him until fairly recently, that he's more obsessive, he's different, he's changed, maybe he's become a bit megalomaniacal, but I don't think he's irrational. And I think, right now it's holding together. And if you look at even the Levada polls, which are fairly good in Russia, now nobody's going to say Putin should die, but there are ways of testing, and he's got a lot of support. People tend to believe the country was at risk, and he is defending the country against NATO aggression, which is what the Chinese are pumping out now, which is extraordinary. So, I just think we need to curb our enthusiasm, because it's, this is existential for him now, as Ed said. And I don't think he's going to throw up his hands and say, yeah, I think I'll just take a slice. I think part of him still wants the whole pie.
Just on the NATO aggression piece, it would come to news to the Ukrainians that NATO is protecting the Ukrainians. It's not quite exactly what they're thinking. We've got a piece on that just in The Economist coming out today, making the argument that the problem wasn't not enough, too much NATO enlargement, but perhaps not enough. So let's switch gears, Karen, and talk a little bit about the Middle East. Although Russia is a major impact in the Middle East too, but there was this extraordinary summit over the weekend of Israeli and Arab and leaders together with Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States, and Blinken spent a good part of the week in the Middle East trying to solidify that alliance, but also, I guess, trying to get countries that in the main aren't with the United States and the rest of the West when it comes to the issue of Russia to get serious about that. So why did this meeting take now? And what, frankly, does it say about the state of the U.S. relationship with what we thought for a very long time were our closest and most important partners outside of our Asian and European allies?
Well, I think we can do a bit of a segue from Ukraine because it's all related. The United States has been trying to get countries in the Gulf to increase their oil production, to make gas prices go down, and that's related to the Russian sanctions. It's trying to get Israel and countries in the Middle East to be more robust in their condemnation of Russian actions in Ukraine. It's trying to get some kind of guarantee about where they are now with the deal with Iran. The deal with Iran had for a time been delayed because the Russians wanted to make sure that the sanctions related to Ukraine would not apply to the relationship with Iran. So it's all kind of one messy thing. But it's true that the administration turned its attention to the Middle East last week. And in some ways, Secretary Blinken, who traveled to the Negev desert in Israel to meet with the Egypt and the members of the Abraham Accords. This was the deal that the Trump administration arranged with Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. To some extent, Blinken was kind of the odd man out in this meeting. You had the other five talking, saying with the Israelis saying, we're setting up a new regional architecture. We want to talk about tech. We want to talk about trade. We want to talk about other exchanges. We want to talk about some kind of new security architecture. And Blinken was there sort of saying, great, we're all for this. This is terrific. But getting a lot of questions from them saying, so what are you going to do to, be our security guarantor in the future, the way you presumably have been in the past? And what's happening with Iran? What are you going to do to protect us if there's no deal? And what bad thing, alternatively, are you going to actually do in a deal that we're not going to like? So everybody was very happy and for the cameras and shaking hands. But again, I think that for the Americans, this was like the others getting together to solidify their relationships and kind of turning to Blinken and saying, so, what are you doing for us now? Or what are you not doing that we would like for you to do? So Blinken went on, he met with Prime Minister Bennett in Israel. Bennett, gave him an earful about the Iran deal. He also met with Abbas in Ramallah, trying to build some assurance that the Biden administration still cares about the Palestinian issue. And the Arabs at the meeting gave some lip service to it, but not anything really that would change the sort of non-existence any kind of progress on that issue. Biden then went on to Morocco to meet with that government, but really to meet with Mohammed bin Zayed, the de facto leader of the United Arab Emirates, which has been extremely unhappy with the United States for reasons that are kind of exasperating to American officials, I have to say, from people that I've talked to. You know, they early on in the Saudi war with Yemen, they participated as a real coalition force. But several years ago, they kind of dropped out and moved to southern Yemen, where they've been working with the Americans basically to fighting against ISIS in the Arab Peninsula, and but the Houthis, with their Iranian-supplied missiles, decided starting in January to start lobbing them at the UAE, and the UAE was shocked and felt like the Americans didn't respond forcefully and quickly enough in terms of sending a senior official there to hold their hand, to rushing more weapons there, even though they're already armed to the teeth and they have lots of weapons. And other than the first missiles that hit in January, they knocked them all down with U.S.-made Patriots, the U.S. THAAD system. But they just have a bad feeling. They're not happy with the Biden administration, and they want to be reassured. I don't know how reassured they were with this meeting, but it certainly was, as far as both sides were concerned, a kind of step in the right direction. Having said that, this week also, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE reiterated that they are not going to increase oil production to any great degree in response to American appeals.
A great summary of the problem, and Ed picking up on the phrase, the odd man out. In some ways, you had the sense that the Israelis and the Arabs were creating a sense of alignment because they no longer trusted the United States, either to defend themselves or to take the Iran issue seriously. And frankly, on the Russia side, they're not on their side either. And so there's a question of, is the United States, which has long talked about walking away from the Middle East or reducing its involvement, or is this the beginning of the end of the relationship that the United States had, or is it, no, we're going to wake up, we're going to figure out how to rebuild our strategic alignment with it? Ed, how do you see it?
The end of the Middle East, America's disengagement or winding down, has been proclaimed many times before. And I think it's the brutal fact of the Middle East's existence and its sort of geographical importance, its importance in terms of the role it plays in supplying China, India, and others with its energy, means that that's inconceivable. The question is, what kind of relationship America is going to have with the Middle East in the future, and there is no simple answer to that. I mean, we've seen the Biden administration, most recently Biden himself in Warsaw, proclaiming that this is a fight between democracy and autocracy. And of course, the Biden administration has many times proclaimed climate change and fossil fuel reduction as one of its goals. But then, 2 days later, because of the reality of the world, Secretary Blinken is in the Middle East asking them, I think in a forlorn request, to step up, to open the spigots and step up oil production. No joy yet, no return call from the Saudis from Biden yet. And of course, he is there rubbing shoulders in the Negev desert at this meeting with the foreign ministers of countries that have as bad or worse human rights records than Russia. So, there are the complexities of, the pitfalls of sort of broader foreign policy principles almost always seem to hit reality when America engages with the Middle East. The Middle East is not alone in terms of sitting on the sidelines, tapping its fingers, waiting to see what happens between Ukraine and Russia. Not complying fully or even at all with sanctions, and I'm including Israel in that, and Turkey to some degree. Latin America isn't really participating. India isn't participating. Africa isn't. So governments representing a majority of the world's population, if a minority of the global economy, are standing back from these sanctions. And that's going to be, that's going to just be the reality of America's engagement with the world. And in that respect, the Middle East isn't sort of different. It's just the thorniest part of it.
Can I just say, I think Ed's absolutely right that we're not seeing the end of the relationship between the United States and the Persian Gulf or other places in the Middle East. It's gone constantly up and down over the years. They really they're not going to turn to Russia to be their security guarantor. They're not going to turn to China. There are tens of thousands of American troops in the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. So I don't think, I think this is much more, part of it is strategic, but part of it's also personal. They feel like they aren't getting enough respect from Biden and the administration.
RESPCT. Remember, Aretha Franklin, we got to, that's, and it was George Shultz who said that diplomacy is like gardening. You got to spend a lot of time just visiting these countries. Steve, a couple more minutes left. You're following closely what's happening on the Iran negotiations. Almost every week we're supposed to get a deal, and it then never seems to be happening. I think you were tweeting out yesterday pictures of the media tents coming down in Vienna. What is the latest you hear on? Is there a deal? Are we going to get there? At some point, the administration will be over before we have a deal.
Well, it's sitting on Biden's desk. It's a very difficult political decision that he has to make, which is about the terrorism designation of the Revolutionary Guards Corps. Now, this was put on by Trump in 2019. It has nothing to do with the JCPOA, right? So the Iranians argue, lift it. There are plenty of other terrorist designations on this same group from Treasury and other places, but symbolically it's important. And for Biden, it's politically difficult. I mean, people hate the deal anyway. The Congress hates it. It's kind of bipartisan hatred. And I was talking to one of the negotiators just a few days ago who was quite frustrated, but they still think even as a weaker deal, and it will be a weaker deal because Trump in a way has made it a weaker deal, it's better than no deal. And we'll see. This person felt it still could happen, but I'd like to think it would still happen, because what worries me is the consequences of it not happening, which is an Iran with lots of uranium enriched to 60%, which has no civilian use, and which will be basically a threshold state. And what the Israelis and the Americans mean when they say, we'll make sure they never have the bomb, it makes me shudder a little bit. So, we'll see. It's very, I'm sure there's, every American negotiator says, oh, no, there's more than one issue, but there really isn't more than one issue. There's just a stalemate between what Iran demands and what the US doesn't want to give them. And it could be done in 24 hours, or it could never happen. So, this is complicated. I don't mean to blame it all on Biden, but it really is a very difficult decision that he has to make, and he seems in no hurry to make it.
That's been a pattern of decision making at times in the White House. If it's hard, maybe don't make the decision. But in any case, I think it is a reminder that there's a lot happening in the world beyond the immediate conflict, brutal as it is in Ukraine, and Putin's designs on the world. I want to thank Karen DeYoung, Ed Luce, and Steve Erlanger for highlighting those difficult aspects of what we're trying to do. Appreciate it to hear your commentary on this, and everyone watching and listening in to our podcast. Thanks for doing so. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Thanks all.